Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyaraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's a College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyaraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. Week 0 is in the books. What a fun slate of games. 4 games with FBS teams went from noon Eastern to past 3 a.m. thanks to our friends on the islands. All were competitive, not all involved playoff teams, but after the offseason, we need games, and those were games that were entertaining to watch. So in today's episode, we're going to need to talk about one of those Week 0 games. Ireland crowned a national champion, and it was not who many expected. What does that mean for the Noles CFP hopes? Then Sean and I will pick 3 teams, each with the potential to collapse and underwhelm this year. I'm not going to say what inspired that particular pick, but you can probably guess. And we're going to try to at least include one team from our CFP candidates, Survivor, the Island, since we are, of course, the College Football Survivor Show, and we're trying to see who's going to make it to the end. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of this show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a second if you can, like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your shows. All right. Well, Sean, how are you doing? Did you enjoy this first weekend as much as I did?
Yeah, this was probably one of the better week 0s that I feel like I've ever watched. Usually I kind of pay like half attention to these games, but I was locked in the entirety of Florida State, Georgia Tech. I mean, it was a really, really good game from the start. I also paid very close attention to SMU versus Nevada. By the way, RJ Maryland, the tight end for SMU, he's going to be a player that I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on. For people who are maybe more like Bobak's age, he's the son of Russell Maryland, the former Miami defensive end and number 1 overall draft pick in 1992. So that's kind of a weird fun fact. He's also from my rival high school up here in DFW, South Lake Carroll. And so, but no, it was a really good week 1. The Charlton McNeese game was pretty dang good. It came down to a late field goal with an opportunity to win. I think you even look at, the Hawaii game wasn't too bad either. So it was a good little mix of kind of that first taste, but also legitimate games that are going to impact the rest of the season.
Yeah, I mean, again, Hawaii, we love you. Probably at this point, we're not going to necessarily book you in as a G5 contender. However, yeah, that was a great game for against a team that really had the worst travel experience in history trying to get to Hawaii. For those who don't know, the bus never showed up, the bus company, to take them to the airport. So they were scrambling to get, I felt bad for the Hornets players. Because imagine, you're an FCS team, you're being paid to go literally across the entire continental United States, and then some, to go and play a game where you're probably going to get squished. But you're going to be on the islands. You missed the beginning. And apparently they had like a luau planned. Only 8 of the players were able to make it to the luau because they were all running so late. So you can imagine like their experience in Hawaii was definitely a little more. Yeah, and I just want to say one other fun game, only because you never get to say this. Congratulations, Montana State, for holding off the upset bid by FBS New Mexico. That was a rare game where the FCS team was favored by 13.5 points. And yet the Bronco Mendenhall, he nearly had New Mexico in it, which, again, how often do we get to say that in reverse roles in that situation? But we are the College Football Survivor Show. We're looking at the true contenders for the playoff. And we're going to set this up. I don't want to say we had one because that's jumping way too far ahead in where things could go. But that loss by Florida State to Georgia Tech in just an entertaining game. And it turned into, I love it. First of all, if you guys were watching game day before, you saw how quickly weather changes in Dublin because they were doing their picks. And like at the beginning of the picks, sky's clear behind them. By the end of the picks, there's like a dark cloud filling the entire street. So by the time the game was going, we had rain here, rain there, may have affected things. Obviously, the Noles kind of, that was probably the worst start they could have hoped for. Oh, that could have been worse. But what do we make of that? Because just the game itself, before we talk about the future of the Noles and their playoff hopes.
Well, I think what was most surprising to me was just in the trenches. Florida State got bullied, and offensive line, they were kind of back and forth, I'd say. But defensive line, this was a unit that I know pregame, some people were saying that that could be one of the best defensive lines in the country, maybe the number one overall unit. They sure didn't look it playing against Georgia Tech. And I will say, like, Georgia Tech, they ranked, I believe, number 6 nationally in returning offensive production. So look, they had that advantage, right? Like that is a legitimate advantage that this is a team that's played together, that knows each other. Their two best playmakers are back in Justice Haynes at running back and Haynes King at quarterback. And also, this is just, I think, a roster and a team that knows how to figure things out in a way that Florida State, even at their best, was probably not made to do. But I think this is also an indicator of how reliant that 2023 team was on having a really good defense. I think that Florida State is still pretty good in the secondary, but in the front seven, they are not what they were last season. And the other piece that I think I have to look at too, that so much is going to be made of DJ Uyanglele, and I don't think it's unfair to give him a lot of blame for what happened in that game. But like, what receiver was getting open? What tight end was getting all that open? What running back was creating opportunities for themselves? It was an offense that really had nothing to hang its hat on, and they kind of needed their quarterback to bail them out, and that's just not the kind of player that DJU's ever been. I probably would have. I mean, one thing that was a little surprising to me, just again speaking strictly from a football perspective, is they really love to go to the sidelines with DJU. I mean, I don't really get that. That's not a pass that he has all that consistently in his arsenal. He's much more consistent and powerful going downfield to the middle of the field. I'd make the case. We saw on those 2 fourth down conversions when, by the way, DJ did allow this team to get back into the game with 2 huge fourth down conversion passes. But like, and this is not to defend DJ. I don't think that he played very well, and I don't think that they're in a great position having him. But the reality is, this is a flawed team in almost every level, every aspect of the game. And one more aside on Florida State. I mean, I think that this is just the danger of trying to restock through the transfer portal year over year. You have to have units that are built primarily through high school, like you just do. They added some receivers through the portal. They added some defensive linemen. They added 2 running backs, right? Like they brought in players to try to fill gaps. And look, they hit gold last season whenever they were able to do that, but it's just hard to do it year over year over year. This is where your high school recruiting needs to pay off in a bigger way. And maybe by the middle of the year, they'll be in that position. But the fact that so many transfers ended up being sort of top contributors for them, whether it's at quarterback, their number one running back, their number one receiver target, like that's just, I don't think that's good enough.
Yeah, it's interesting because that was one of the things I know when we were trying to put together a list that I was hesitant about, which is you're replacing so many key guys on a team that was extremely talented last season, no doubt, and obviously they went undefeated for most of the season, but sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, expecting it to work each time. It's like, okay, well, let's see how it. I didn't quite expect it to not work in game one, at least like that. And I'm going to be a little bit more like DJU. I felt a little bad for him because I'm also wondering, like, Norvell seemed to be conservatively play calling. So I think, and what were we told? Like he was going to be a game manager. He was going to be competent. And he was like, he didn't like throw bad passes that ended up into costly picks. He commanded the offense. It just that suddenly, as you said, like they needed the other areas to be better and they weren't, to the point where suddenly everyone was looking at him like, why? I mean, I wonder if he got stuck in a position where people were looking at DJU and expecting him to bail them out when he was expecting to kind of, in this game, just to sort of take over and kind of just manage this offense. At the very least, though, Ryan Fitzgerald blew everyone away with that leg of his. I mean, that was something else. That 59-yarder to end the first half was remarkable. And I believe he had a 52 before that. But, it's interesting looking ahead now. I mean, it's so funny because for those of us who've been involved in college football for any length of time, the BCS era, I remember those days. This probably would be a tough call for Florida State to recover from that. They'd probably be toast. Now, the 14 playoff era, I still think of 2014 Ohio State. They lost that game to Virginia Tech, not a great Virginia Tech team. I mean, they went 7-6, but they managed to obviously get it. That was their only loss. They managed to get it together, and by the end of the season, were winners of the first CFP title. The 12-team playoff, though, boy, it seems like. Well, I don't want to say like it's. I almost wanted to say like ain't nothing but a thing. It's a little more than that. Like what we saw was still a little concerning. But do you think this is something Florida State fans can recover from? Do you think Florida State fans can look at this and expect the Noles to recover from this loss and make a big play for the playoff as the season goes on?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think the biggest takeaway from week 0 is the fact that the 12-team college football playoff changes the game for everybody. In previous years, this literally means that Florida State's season is over already, that their 11 remaining games essentially don't matter. You're back into rebuilding. In the new college football playoff, it means your job is a lot harder, but you have the ability to play your way back. And they can do that a couple of different ways. One, certainly the easiest way is to go and win the ACC. If they win the ACC, they have a chance to make the college football playoff and likely get a first round bye. That didn't exist in the 4-team college football playoff. Florida State went 13-0 last season, and it didn't matter. They didn't even get in the field that way. So this is, I think, going to be one of the weirdest things for fans to adjust to, is the idea that, yes, they can be doomer about their team in the moment, but they don't need to doom their entire season as a result. Reasonable people can disagree on whether this is a good thing, right? I mean, people value the idea of the most valuable regular season in sports, but I think that you also look at college football, that's only applied to a couple of teams, right? Like when you look at Alabama last year, they lose in week 2. Well, guess what? The most valuable regular season in sports didn't seem to matter as much to them. They still made the college football playoff. Florida State went 13-0. It didn't seem to matter to them. They didn't make the college football playoff. So I think overall, I mean, when you look at the end of the year, we're going to have 30 to 35 teams that are still competitive for the college football playoff between at-larges and conference championships. This is just, to me, a much better way to look at and approach the sport than the idea of just saying, well, we're just done with Florida State now. Now there's only 133 teams that we have to pretend to care about in college football.
You're absolutely right about that. I mean, especially looking ahead, their schedule. Actually, now I'm thinking of a dark scenario, a doomsday scenario, but I'll get to that in a moment. Florida State has so many opportunities to impress. I mean, now Memphis is probably the most annoyed team by all of this, because Florida State is the marquee game that if they were to pull an upset or now it would be a little less impressive. But Memphis, in their bid to be the G5 the participant in the 12-team playoff, they're probably a little annoyed by this. But they still have some great games left. And the good news for the Seminoles, they've got, the next couple of games, Boston College, they're still quite favored in that game at home. Memphis, Cal, at SMU, we'll get to them probably in just in a brief moment. But then they get the tougher games. You got the Clemson at home. You got at Florida. We've talked about these games at Notre Dame, the finale at Florida. If they can if they can kind of develop the team as they're going, because again, a lot of the flaws we saw in Ireland were not things that can't be fixed with experience. I mean, some, missed tackles, losing the battle in the line of scrimmage, you can kind of coalesce. Maybe that defensive line in particular will kind of find that groove as they play the next couple of games, even though, again, against a veteran offensive line, they were ready to just shove them right back. There's opportunities for them to develop and strengthen by the time they get to the meat of their schedule, and then potentially get some really impressive wins. I mean, we've seen programs that do this. That Ohio State team I just talked about in 2014. Pete Carroll's teams were always famous for having that one early season game where they kind of mess up, and by the end of the season, no one wanted to play them. But of course, it was a BCS era, so they usually were boxed out. I think there's an opportunity here. I think there's a chance for Florida State fans to particularly see it. But of course, the doomsday scenario I kind of want to see, which would be hilarious, is if Florida State somehow, again, wins the ACC, but somehow loses to Memphis, maybe to Florida, maybe to Notre Dame, and somehow goes in as because I still remember I think it was the first season, the Sun Belt sponsored football. North Texas became the first team with a losing record to actually go to a bowl game because they won the Sun Belt, but they lost everything else and had a messy time in the Sun Belt. Now, not saying the Noles are going to do that, but it would be amusing if we saw a P4 champion go into the playoff with 3 or 4 losses. But underlining the fact that they were also their conference champion. And that's going to be kind of fun. I know some people might not like that, but if you're kind of like a fan who just loves the idea of just teams kind of pulling it out and getting it together and bringing it together at the last second, that could be glorious. That could, especially if a team like that goes on. People love that in the NFL. Why can't they like that in college? When you have a team like a wild card team that goes forward, people kind of dig that. So by all means, why not here? Why not in the college football playoff? The 12-team playoff has got me excited the more I think about Florida State's loss, as weird as it is to say.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. And I mean, again, we love the idea of the team that gets hot at the end of the year and heads into March Madness and makes a Sweet 16, right? Like this is something that we love. And I think again, we've gotten so used to the idea of the only thing that matters being the national championship and nothing else that we haven't conceptualized the idea that if Florida State does get hot, because I'll tell you what, I mean, if they finish 12-1, they're gonna deserve it. They play at SMU, like you mentioned, versus Clemson, at Miami, at Notre Dame, versus Florida. Those are 5 really good games. And so if they're 12-1, they're absolutely going to deserve to be a team that should play in the college football playoff. Now, all that said, this to me does not look like a team that has the quality of making the college football playoff. And I know we got some hate mail from Belarus about not putting Florida State in our preseason list of contenders, but this is why. This is why. We saw this as a team that had to transform so much of what they did well last season. And ultimately, they weren't able to do it in time for week 0. They'll have a chance to try to pull it together, but is this defensive line going to be ready for Clemson, for SMU, for Duke and Miami? Like, I don't know. I think it's a really fair question to ask. And while they have a chance to get better over the course of the season, so does Miami. So does Notre Dame, who they play in November. So does Florida, who they play in November. So my bigger takeaway for Florida State specifically from this game is I don't think they have the juice this year. I don't think they have the playmakers to hang. But I'm glad that I don't have to stop watching their games and say that their season's irrelevant before week 1 even starts.
Well, I hope our Belarusian friend out there, our comrade out there, had an opportunity to watch this Ireland game because the time differences were good. I want to just, and it's a little early to ask about this, but Georgia Tech looked pretty good on Saturday. At what point in this season? Because I was looking at the schedule they have ahead of them. They're playing. Apparently, I'm surprised they don't have a rivalry nickname for this because they're playing Georgia State. Those two teams are not far away from each other. Granted, Georgia State only started playing football in the last 15 years or so. But so they're playing Georgia State. Fine. Then they're going on the road to Syracuse. That game suddenly seems really intriguing because how's Kyle McCord going to look like out there at Syracuse? Playing in the dome out there, and I know it's not the Carrier Dome, it's like the JMA Wireless Dome, but seeing that game is going to be really intriguing because suddenly Georgia Tech, and again, the beauty of week 0 or any early season game, we're going to look back at this maybe midseason and go like, one of these teams was either way better or way worse than we were giving credit there. Like, is it that Florida State is bad or is Georgia Tech like having one of those? For those who don't remember, I think the last time Georgia Tech had a really good season was actually also 2014. That was when they climbed from being unranked to winning the ACC and going to the Orange Bowl. That was kind of the Paul Johnson special. Who knows? I'm not, again, a little early to say that's what's going on with Brent Key, but, let's look at it that way. But I'm kind of curious now to see where Georgia Tech falls in the ACC grouping because we were kind of skeptical. We said things are looking good for Key and company. But now that game at Syracuse and then a few weeks later at Louisville, man, that's going to be a lot more interesting to see who's really in this contention for the ACC. I'm not going to say let's put them on the island yet, but Georgia Tech, you have my attention. I'm very curious to see where this is going to go.
Well, and I'll tell you what, so to go outside just for a second, they landed a top 200 player, defensive lineman Christian Garrett, after this game. They already had a commitment from Josh Petty, who's the best ranked recruit that they've gotten since Calvin Johnson. They also have another top 150 kid. They're number 19 in the country. So people are starting to believe in this thing just a little bit. People are buying what Brent Key's putting down. And I'll say too, They were picked number 9 in the preseason ACC poll. They got a first place vote. I have no idea who would have given them a first place vote. I probably would
It's like
not.
when Vandy gets a first place vote in the SEC poll.
Well. No. That's when Boston College does, which, by the way, they did, even though they're 14th in the preseason ACC poll. No idea what happened there. But I mean, I think you look and they're right there in the middle with a chance to strike, right? Because Florida State, of course, they've already got a win over. They've got a head-to-head over. We've talked about kind of this next group. I mean, I think, put Clemson aside, Miami, NC State, Louisville, Virginia Tech, SMU. We've talked about all those teams as being potential ACC contenders as well. And so I think you kind of put Georgia Tech there with North Carolina, with Cal. We'll see what Duke is. That Syracuse game, like you mentioned, really interesting. They do have one of the tougher schedules in the country. Opening, of course, with Florida State, closing with Georgia, playing NC State, Virginia Tech, Notre Dame, Louisville in between, and Miami, by the way. But I still do think this is a team that if they can be in that 7 to 8 win range and show even more growth than what they had last season, I mean, I'm very excited to see what they've got going on. And the other thing I'll mention is, of course, I've watched Haynes King since he was a high school student at Longview High School. I remember I didn't realize how many people who I knew who were from Longview until they played in the state title game when he was a junior. And every person that I knew was like, oh, by the way, I went to Longview High School and I'm a huge Haynes King fan. And they go and win their first state title since 1937 that year. But he's just a playmaker. Like, I'm so glad that he got into an offense and a situation where he's just allowed to do stuff, where he's allowed to use his legs, where he's allowed to pull his arm all the way back to throw the ball like he really wants to do. Like, it's just fun to see guys put in situations where they can unload, and this is absolutely that.
Absolutely. It's yeah, my goodness. One other team I wanted to bring up, and only because they were also playing on Saturday, and they're a team that are more of a dark horse, but one that comes up again for the ACC. We talked about it briefly. What do we make of SMU? That game at Nevada was a little closer than people were expecting. I know you were watching it. What were your takeaways there, and what? Not reading too much into it, but how do you feel about them? Right? How do you feel about the Ponies right now?
Well, the big question about them heading into the year was how do they replace what they lost on the offensive line? They lost 2 starters in Marcus Bryant to Missouri and Branson Hickman to Oklahoma, who should have been mainstays of that offensive line. But talent wise, it felt like they were in good shape. Like, I know that one of the guys that they brought in was PJ Williams, who was a top 75 national recruit from Texas A&M. They just don't look ready. They just don't look ready. And I also think, they've made a lot about they have 2 quarterbacks that they have a lot of faith in, Preston Stone and Kevin Jennings. Kevin Jennings was actually the quarterback when they won the AAC last year because Preston Stone broke his leg. And they wanted to try to get both into the game. They got a little bit too cute there, right? Like, they got a little bit too cute, kind of going back and forth with these quarterbacks early in the game. Neither was really able to get into a rhythm. And Preston Stone only really got into a rhythm in the second half when he was the full-time starting quarterback. So I'm not super worried necessarily. This feels like hey, we tried some stuff and it didn't work and was a bad idea. But I think that the offensive line is something I'm going to be keeping a close eye on. I don't know when they head into an ACC schedule whether they're going to be able to hang. Their defense also just has to contain better. Like, Brendan Lewis, the former Colorado transfer turned Nevada quarterback, was just picking up 5 yards on miscommunications time after time after time. And, with SMU, they play TCU and BYU in the non-conference. They open with Florida State. They go to Louisville. Like, they play, especially in the early going, some games that I think that they have to win to be taken seriously as even just an ACC dark horse type team. They're going to have to figure some of this stuff out.
I think at least one thing SMU fans can look forward to is their next 4 games are at home and of increasing difficulty, which allows you to tune a little bit. Luckily, you get an FCS game with Houston Christian Huskies coming in, but then you get, as you said, BYU, which Big 12, but we're still not entirely sure where Kalani Stocky's team is right now. TCU expected to be a little bit better than BYU. And then Florida State to open, which is going to be really interesting to see where Florida State is as they try to retool after what happened again this past weekend. But it's really intriguing to see. And again, I'm loving this. I mean, 4 games. We already have we had 3 different interesting teams to talk about already and how they're looking. My goodness. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about, other teams that could potentially have the opportunity to, underwhelm, collapse, however you want to say it this season, here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so again, we were heading into this season with teams that we thought were going to be college football contenders. We knew that people weren't always going to make it. When we built our island, when we built our teams, when we named the teams, and again, I love the way you did it. You put them in tiers, which I think is a little more sensible than trying to just do a straight up ranking. But sometimes teams don't quite meet expectations. That happens year after year. Florida State obviously stumbled out the gate, can recover. 12-team playoff makes it very possible to do that. Not necessarily probable, but possible to do that. What are some teams, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. We're looking for teams that potentially could implode at any point during the season, or just kind of fall from expectations. We're not going to pick on teams that really have low expectations, but teams that we think should do better, but there's something about them that could come apart and just cause it all to fall down.
No, I think that's a good way to put it, right? It's like, I really want to look at teams that have some expectations, whether it's competing for their conference, winning 9 or 10 games, who, like Florida State, maybe they're banking on some stuff that they shouldn't be banking on. Whether it's because they relied heavily on the transfer portal or there was just some assumption. For me, I think longtime listeners of this podcast probably know I'm somebody who is I very much err towards returning production and known commodities versus feeling comfortable just projecting ahead. That's one reason that I didn't want Florida State in my field, is because I just felt like there was so much projection necessary for them to be an elite team once again. But, and again, I think even when I'm looking at transfers, one thing that I'd point to is that a lot of the guys who Florida State brought in to be major contributors, Roydell Williams, a good example, really talented, really good player at running back from Alabama, but not somebody who had played a lot, not somebody who was a proven commodity in college football. I'd personally make the distinction between a player like that and a player like Damon Martinez, going to Miami, who was a 1,000-yard rusher at the power conference level, coming from Oregon State. So for me, I think that that's really what I'm looking for, is some teams, and some at the top, some maybe more in the middle to the upper middle class, let's say, who potentially could go the way of Florida State, who we might be banking on some things happening that just won't happen.
So starting this off here, what was a team that kind of fits into that category for you? Give us a good example here.
Sure. Well, I think that, Florida State, of course, was one that I had some skepticism about, but another team that I think that I am very curious about, and especially previewing a week 1 matchup that I think could be huge, is Notre Dame. And the biggest reason that I say Notre Dame is because, yes, we know, Riley Leonard is going to be a good quarterback for them. I think he's going to be a clear upgrade at the position. They're starting 2 freshman tackles against Texas A&M's defensive line. You're going to put a freshman out there to deal with Nick Scornton? Is that really your plan? I know. Joe Alt was a freshman who came out and did this, and I know they're excited about some of the freshmen that they have. But that's a lot. That's a lot to open the year going to Kyle Field against a really talented Texas A&M defensive line and saying, well, screw it. Let's throw some freshmen out there. And look, that's losing that one game doesn't end their season by any means, right? But they do play 2 or 3 kind of tough games. They play Florida State later in the year. They play, ironically, Georgia Tech later in the year. They play Louisville. They go to USC. I think that they're still this is the thing. I think that their floor is still probably 9 wins, but it's 9 wins and being the 21st ranked team in the country because you just can't handle it. If Notre Dame loses this Texas A&M game, especially if they lose it by more than a score, like I think that their pathway to, for example, hosting a playoff game, it's just off the table for me. And there is absolutely a possibility that if they handle this first week badly, things could spiral.
Yeah, they were one of the teams I was looking at. And I kind of built a few more just so we could maybe add a few more teams into this. But I agree. I mean, I think I was reading they only have 6 combined career starts on this offensive line heading into the season. That's not good. That's a low number. And again, they're starting, as you pointed out, against the strongest defensive front they may see all year. Because it ain't going to be USC by the time they get to that game at the end. So, I mean, and then, just beyond that, can the passing game click? Because again, you're dealing with transfers. I mean, Riley Leonard, great quarterback at Duke, kind of counting it works here. Last season, Sam Hartman again, and part of that problem was the wide receiver room. How good was it? Again, they got transfers. They got Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, Jaden Harris, plus the person you like, Jaden Greathouse, is out there. They have a good, former walk-on, Jordan Faison, that they can also go to. But putting it all together, there's opportunities for this. Well, opportunities is the wrong word. There's chances here where it could come apart, especially when you have a schedule that, again, we've talked about. This is a very favorable schedule for a year 3 Notre Dame coach. But when it's a favorable schedule, when, getting towards the end of the year, if we're talking about who's going to make the college football playoff, that could be held against him if it doesn't work out. And again, these marquee games, especially the one at the beginning against Texas A&M, and although the luster on Florida State may be a little bit questionable, it still will probably be a good game and a good opponent. They need this, and again, we just watch what happens when a line that has plenty of talent, not really has played together, goes against an experienced line just with the Florida State Georgia Tech game. So yeah, there's a lot to go there. Another team I kind of looked at here, and this is one I hate bringing them up because I feel like we're picking on something. And just to kind of remind our viewers, we put Notre Dame on tier 2 of kind of the teams that we think are contenders, especially in this island. I mean, the tier 1 is very small. It's Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and then which are pretty universally held to be the 3 most likely contenders to be fighting their way to that championship game. But also on tier 2, and I kind of did my section in tiers because these are the ones that I'm a little worried about, and it's Utah, only because Cam Rising's health is a major factor in this, and I know they have a good quarterback behind him, but the experience of Rising and what we saw last season when he wasn't available, a Utah team that was good, but not the one that was able to go and win the Pac-12 the previous 2 seasons. And they also, speaking of it, they also need an offensive line to make kind of an improvement in pass protection. I didn't realize that they were quite as bad as they were the previous season. And then they've got to replace 3 starters from that unit, which could be good sometimes when they weren't great before. Let's see what the new guys are like. But it was just what we were talking about Notre Dame. Now, and it's funny because both Notre Dame and Utah, I'm not worried about the defense. Both of those defenses are going to be solid. I'm just concerned about Utah's offense. And if this team is going to have an issue, it's going to be because, again, I hope not an issue, but just something in that offense. Maybe it is just the line isn't there enough. And I'm not sure when it's going to get challenged because they have a schedule that starts, well, Southern Utah. The Baylor game will be interesting because it's against Dave Aranda. I'm very curious to see how that goes. But then, Utah State's kind of an interesting state of flux right now. We'll see where they're at. But then that Oklahoma State game midway through September, I'm looking forward to seeing that. And then we're going to see how they do as the season goes on. But Utah's in that group for me. I'm kind of a little concerned that if things were to fall apart, it's going to be on Riley. Riley Leonard. It's going to be on Cam Rising's shoulders.
No, I think it's a totally fair point. I obviously am very high on Utah, but there are 2 things that I think could really make this thing fall apart. One, certainly another Cameron Rising injury, especially if Sam Heward, who transferred over from Cal Poly, isn't what I think he could be, right? Like a former 5-star, but also one who wasn't amazing, certainly at the Big Sky level. And I don't think that that's fully his fault, but like he might just not be good, right? Like he might just not be good. They also lost a player at center in I'm gonna mess up this name, Kolinu Fayo, who transferred to Texas A&M. He was their starting center for most of the last year. It's weird to lose a guy like that when you're not all that experienced on the offensive line. Like that feels like a priority. to try to keep a player like that around. Now, I'm sure there was stuff behind the scenes that made it, maybe unpalatable for him to come back. But this offensive line is the big question about this offense in general. Like, they weren't very good last year, and it's hard to be very good when you can't pass the ball downfield with any consistency. I think that actually adding some of these receivers like Dorian Singer was a way to compensate in some ways for an offensive line that and give them just a little bit more time and opportunity, but there's no guarantee that that's going to work. So I mean, look, there's a chance that this line isn't good. They lost Jaquindon Jackson, who was their top rusher last season. They bring back Micah Bernard, who was like supposed to be their number one rusher from last season. So I feel okay about that. But there's pathways to this offense still just not being very good. And again, they're one or two injuries away on defense, I would say, from being a good, not great unit. So we'll kind of have to wait and see what happens there. But I don't hate this, even though I've been as big of a Utah fan this offseason as just about anybody.
Well, who else do you have? What's another team that's kind of on your radar for potential hiccups?
Yeah, I don't think that the second one's going to come as a huge surprise to anybody who's heard me this offseason. I'm going with Oklahoma. And the reason I say offensive line is probably top on the list. Like, it is weird for a Bill Biedenbaugh unit to be this unproven, to have this few guys who have played major snaps for them. They're going to be relying in a huge way on transfers. And we've talked all offseason about Colorado trying to figure out how to integrate a brand new offensive line. Well, now Oklahoma has to do it. And by the way, they have to do it with a first-year starting quarterback in Jackson Arnold. And they have to do it with a running back room that hasn't really popped, I think, the way that people expected so far under Brent Venables. And, I think they should be pretty good at receiver, but it's kind of a little up in the air, like at the same time, especially Nick Anderson's dealing with some injury stuff. They lost Jaden Gibson to an injury, who I think was going to be a big time player for them if he had been healthy. So like, they have guys certainly, but it changes, I would argue, the way that you look at this unit if this offensive line is just terrible, right? Like, if this offensive line is not good, and they lost two guys to the NFL just last year, and their unit was good, not awesome, even when you look at the 2023 unit. Defensively, they should take another step forward, but I also don't know on the defensive line, is this going to be an elite unit or just a pretty good unit? They're starting a freshman that they feel really good about at defensive tackle, but it is still a freshman starting at defensive tackle. So that'll be kind of a big question mark for them. How quickly can he kind of get up to speed? It's just like, it's a weird team. It's a weird team. It's a weird team. It's a weird roster. It's a weird situation. It's a weird time. It's not the team that I would have expected to be going in, kind of starting from scratch in some ways, heading into the SEC. I don't know what to think.
And that schedule is absolutely, I mean, compared to Texas, I think their schedule is pretty damn tough. I mean, they open, they at least it's a home game, but they open against Tennessee, which is absolutely an outside contender in all of this. I mean, and I don't mean far outside. I mean, we're just thinking maybe more next year than this year. Going on the road to Auburn, obviously the Red River game, but my goodness. And then they get that wonderful stretch at the end at Mizzou, Alabama coming to Norman, and then at LSU. It's going to be a stress test, and so they're not going to really get an opportunity to. Again, there's some teams that have had an easier situation. This ain't a Rutgers schedule. This is just a few shades short of Florida's schedule this season. So again, as we were putting together the tiers in our last episode, the third tier again, it included Florida State, a team we had questions about. Questions that ended up being quite legit when we saw them against Georgia Tech this past weekend. But one I also couldn't explain because I also included the AP preseason rankings. And for the life of me, the number 9 Michigan ranking just seems so optimistic. I mean, you lose so much. I mean, yes, there is some internal consistency. Sharon Moore obviously had been there prior, but you lose Harbaugh. You lose a couple of key guys who left with him. And then the entire roster, not the entire roster, but many of those starting guys. I mean, look at all those NFL draft picks. What was it, like 14? You have to replace the 6 best offensive linemen. J.J. McCarthy, who was we talked about how high he went in the selections. Blake Corum. There are so many parts here where you could pick any potential little part of that. where things could start coming apart and where now the defense again, this seems to be kind of something we keep going back to. Defense seems a little bit more confident. We're pretty faith. I mean, they've still got that Mason Graham. They've still got a lot of talent on throughout the defense. But if this team is to come apart, you pick it. It's an experience. It's a new regime. I mean, just you can make your choice. I think Michigan is definitely going to be one where I think it's the one I'd be the least surprised if it does not meet expectations because something kind of just falls apart midseason. Because gosh knows Harbaugh's teams early on occasionally have those moments as well.
Well, and I think the big question for me is like, how bad can the offense be and them still be like passably good? Because to me, they're losing week 2 against Texas, right? Like,
Should we
I
call them
think
the
they are.
Michigan Hawkeyes? Sorry.
No, I mean, but I was going to circle around to that point, right? Like, that's kind of what we're looking at. They played 3 of the top 4 teams in the country, by the way, in Texas, Ohio State, and Oregon. They play kind of a weird game against USC. If they lose that USC game, especially with like all the talk about USC and they're like, oh, they're not Big Ten ready, they're not physical, all this sort of stuff. They lose to USC, like we are going to be saying some stuff after that game. I'll tell you what. And so, like, I think the question again is like, how bad are they allowed to be on offense and still be pretty good? Because defensively, they're going to be a top 5 defense. They just are. Their defensive tackle interior, like you mentioned, their secondary is still really good. At linebacker, they still have plenty of talent even after losing Junior Colson. So like, they're going to be good defensively, but all reports out of camp right now are that Alex Orji is just not ready to throw the ball at an FBS level. And they're kind of looking at a former walk-on in Davis Warren to maybe be the guy who's pushing him. If I heard like, oh, Jaden Davis looks really good in camp right now, the star freshman for them. If I heard like, oh, Jaden Denegal, he's somebody who I had heard a little bit of chatter about in the spring. Well, he's apparently disappeared. Like, I don't know what the plan is here. I just don't know. Like, can you be a single wing team, by the way, after losing your entire offensive line as well, and still be a 9 or 10 win team in the Big Ten? It's a weird year. It's a weird team. It's a weird situation. And also, by the way, they're going to have like a lot of weirdness hanging over their head just because of all of the NCAA stuff and whatever. So like, I don't know. To me, this is a team that will. I think that they win 8 or 9. Like I think that they still end up being pretty good, but they lose all 3 to the top 4 teams, and I think that they drop another somewhere along the way, just because I don't think that they have the margin of error that they've had in years past. And by the way, if Jim Harbaugh was back, they might still have been in this situation just because of how much they lose on offense. They don't have receivers at all. That's the part about this that people aren't talking enough about. They're talking a lot about Alex Orji, and they're less talking about who is he going to be throwing the ball to. The answer is Colston Loveland, and who the heck knows?
That's a great point. You're right. The wide receiver situation has not been discussed enough because we're all just curious who's going to be chucking the ball to begin with. So who is the third? Because again, we're doing just 3 teams each. Give us your third team that you think could potentially have that moment of implosion or just start coming apart.
Well, this was a team that I was shocked to see had an over-under as high as it did. And this is, I mean, frankly, this is one of those things, right? Where like you have these conversations with people around college football in the know, and then you look up and you look at what the expectations are among, I guess, normal people, and they're just completely out of whack with what you expect. What is Auburn doing with a 7.5 over-under? Like, what are they doing with a 7.5 over-under? I mean, offensively, like they brought in some receivers who I think will help. I don't think they're going to be quite as bad passing the ball as they were last year, but Peyton Thorne's still the guy. I don't think that they're special by any means on the offensive line. I don't know that they're guaranteed to run the ball as effectively as they did last season. I think they're going to have to figure some of that out. Defensively, I don't know exactly what to expect from them. Are they still going to be an elite unit? They replaced both coordinators after 1 year of Hugh Freeze. Hugh Freeze is going to be back calling the plays. I think that's mostly a good thing, but like, yeah, you just don't know for certain that it's going to be a good thing with all the responsibilities that he has as being the Auburn head coach. I don't know. And by the way, they are 85th in returning defensive production. So I don't think you can just assume that the defense is going to just be awesome. And am I mistaken that they brought in DJ Durkin to run that defense? I think that,
No, you're
yeah.
right.
Yeah. Not my number one choice to come in and run the defense from a strictly football perspective. Like you look at his past couple of stops. I mean, the last time he was putting together consistently good defenses, like you almost have to go back to when he was at Michigan in 2015. The defenses were all right at Maryland, but Ole Miss, Texas A&M, Auburn, he hasn't really had good defenses at any of those stops. I don't know, man. I do not understand what Auburn is doing here with a 7.5 over under. I think if they got to 7, that should be seen as a really, really successful year. And and look, I mean, they have 4 games in the non-conference that they should win. A home game against Cal will be kind of squirrely, but not that much. But they play Oklahoma, Georgia, Missouri. They're at Kentucky. They're versus Texas A&M. They're at Alabama. That's 6 games right there where I think they're going to be pretty decent underdogs in all of those games. I don't know, man. I just do not see the vision here.
Yeah, it's tough to pick it up. People are assuming that Arkansas game, and again, if the 85th ranked defense, and hey, you can say what you will, but we're talking about coaches of controversial nature being hired. I mean, that Arkansas offense could suddenly turn itself around and put up some points. Vandy though is Vandy. We love you, Clark, but it's tough. It's a tough game out there, and we understand that. But yeah, it's hard to see that, particularly with Auburn, and particularly. And I mean, how much of though is this faith in Peyton Thorne? I know you're not necessarily as sold on him this season, but if he can, do you think is it based on his performance, what we can expect out of this Auburn team, or is it run deeper than that?
Well, I think that I would say nationally, there's not a whole lot of faith in Peyton Thorne. Like I think that he maybe even a little bit to an unfair extent was blamed for how bad this offense was last season. But I think it's just structurally everything, right? Like this was a team that didn't necessarily pass block especially well. Is that something that's going to be fixed? They didn't have targets, and yes, they have some really, really, really exciting freshmen coming in at receiver. But like, is Cam Coleman going to fix Auburn's offense? Maybe, but like, it's a lot to ask, and it's a lot to ask, by the way, when you do have a quarterback who has struggled with consistency issues. And, I think that probably the one thing that can give a little bit of optimism is that when he was at his best at Michigan State, he was a deep play wizard, right? Like he was hitting Jaden Reed and Jalen Naylor, I believe, was the other receiver downfield over and over and over again. And maybe that's just what this offense looks like. It's kind of ironic actually that they fired Phil Montgomery as offensive coordinator when he's the deep shot guy, right? Like he's the old Baylor system guy. I'm curious to see how they kind of structure their offense this year with maybe some exciting young receivers who might not be ready to play receiver at a high level in the SEC. But I don't know. For me, I just don't quite see the vision there. And I worry that they're going to ask Peyton Thorne to do some stuff that I don't know he's capable of doing.
I'm going to just kind of wrap this up. My final pick is actually kind of the based of a matchup, one that I'm going to be actually attending this upcoming weekend, and it's a two-parter. It's the winner of LSU USC and the loser of LSU USC. I think either of those can still go on to completely implode in some way, shape, or form. Because again, the similarities are there. You have two schools, two programs last season where the offenses were obviously one case LSU Heisman worthy, and then the other one kind of formerly Heisman worthy, kind of a little bit of a hiccup, trying to do a little too much because both defenses were equally bad. So therefore, you have two programs where this opening game in Vegas, whoever wins is going to feel better about themselves, but it's still not going to be an accurate read, only because we know who the other team is. They're both new quarterbacks replacing Heisman winners, both defenses with new defensive coordinators. Blake Baker, obviously with LSU, trying to fix a defense that was 108th, trying to improve the communication that's going on so they look a little bit more organized. And again, trying to improve a program that where, we've heard what Brian Kelly said about trying to get some of the people he was trying to get in the transfer portal and not necessarily being able to get them. USC, we know again there, the defense was even somehow worse. Danton Lynn has been brought away from UCLA to try and improve a defense that was 119th in total defense last season. Again, with both of these two defensive coordinators, on paper, you expect improvement, but is it going to be a situation where the defensive coaching talent, I haven't even mentioned the other assistant coaches there, and we've talked about them in previous episodes, but is this going to be enough to bring those defenses up to the level of the coaches that are there? And also in USC, we might as well throw in, can the offensive line improve more? Because that's been something that has been a step back compared to exactly what Lincoln Riley had going on in Oklahoma. So both of these teams, whoever loses is going to already sound like they're imploding, but obviously they can recover from that, because just like we said with Florida State, the rest of the season's out there, you can still recover, and both of these teams have the talent to at least make a run for it. But with LSU in particular, because again, USC, I'm a little less on them only because they're kind of in the reverse situation. I mean, the number 23 preseason ranking seems a little generous. They're more of a team. What's a team you think could actually get it together and overachieve this year? USC's more in that category. But LSU, that preseason number 13 ranking, we didn't even have them in our 4 tiers when I looked at it. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge, apparently our esteemed colleagues in the who write for the AP thought that they are the 13th ranked team. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if there's enough here to make that come together to be a playoff contender this season, let alone the number. Because when you're saying the number 13 team and an SEC program, and that you absolutely will have a fighting chance of, if not win the conference, at least getting that large bid. If LSU comes apart, it's because that defense just isn't there yet. And this is not going to be a conference where they're going to allow that to stand.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. I think for me, I just couldn't consider USC as being in this group because I don't think expectations for them are all that high. I think that people see them as a 7-win team or something like that, right? And so like you said, I think that if they are, 26, 27 in the preseason AP poll and not technically in the rankings, people would feel a little better about what this team is and what this team could be. I do think that LSU is a decent candidate for this though, because they're just having to revamp so much on both sides of the ball. Of course, Jaden Daniels was their top passer and their top rusher. He was a 1,000-yard rusher for them. Garrett Nussmeier, I think, is a pretty good player, but he's not going to be that. They lost their 2 best receivers to the NFL draft as well. I don't know necessarily that they're going to be quite as special at that position. Defensively, I love the addition of Blake Baker as a defensive coordinator, but is it just turnkey, right? Like, are they just going to figure it out immediately? I think that's a lot to ask of any first year coordinator, even with one who's working with the defense as talented as this. But I mean, if this is a top 75 defense, but the offense isn't incredible, is that a win necessarily versus last year when, by the way, they weren't a top 13 team, especially for most of the year last year too? I don't know. It's kind of a weird position to be in. And I mean, the one thing that makes me think that this isn't a true fall apart candidate necessarily is their offensive line might be like top 3 in the country. Their tackle combo, both guys could be first round picks potentially, but they also do have enough games with USC versus Ole Miss, at Texas A&M versus Alabama versus Oklahoma. They even have kind of a weird game at South Carolina. They have a weird game at Florida. There are enough potholes here where this could be a 4 or 5 loss team. I'm curious though, if they go 8-4, is that a collapse? I feel like they have to hit 7 for it to be considered a collapse.
I would say 7, but I would be very curious to see if they can sneak in an impressive win among those 8. I think that'll be even bigger positive considering what they had going in. But again, the number 13, that's an optimistic ranking. I hadn't even considered them until I saw that ranking. And I agree. USC would have to win the game against LSU for them to be on but they're going to potentially implode a little later down the season. Because it could very well be that LSU is a 7-win team or an 8-win team that isn't all that impressive. And that's the glory of it. That's the beauty of the preseason, or at least the early season games in the week 0, week 1 games, sometimes even week 2 games, where we see that and then eventually we'll get our lovely September Heisman kind of going into the end of this upcoming month. Well, I think that's going to do it for us here on the College Football Survivor Show. This was it's good. We're going to obviously come back with another show a little later this week. Probably taking a little look forward to what's coming up in week 1. But my goodness, as I said at the outset, what a fun week 0 slate of games. Even the games that didn't necessarily have an impact on the FBS National Championship. My goodness, those were fun to watch and fun to be a part of. We can't wait to see more of it. There's going to be games throughout the week, by the way. I love that. We have like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday college football games. Can't get enough of it. I want to thank our listeners, thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.